I'm here, really. Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is Tuesday. We're getting into that stage now where my office is turning into quite the sweat pit. So I might start off one of them GoFundMe pages for aircon. Think about that for a while. Anyway, welcome everyone that is online now. If you're watching in the future, you missed it. So you won't be able to add comments and questions and interact, but you will at least be able to watch the next hour. And you guys, I guess, can fast forward, but you'll be able to watch the next hour as we're editing in that program, Capture One. Capture One being the raw processing software that is made by the clever software guys out in Copenhagen, in Denmark. And they take your data that your camera saves when you save a raw file. So you can edit other files in Capture One, of course, but it's best served with raw files. So if your camera has the function, you can save the data as raw. That means that Capture One can open that data up and it can apply certain profiles to it. It can allow us to make lots of changes after the fact. So we can change the feel of the image, we can change the warmth of the image, we can hopefully get back some data that would have been lost if you'd saved it as a JPEG out of the camera itself. So we're going to spend, as I said, next hour going through your images. I had a request this week to go through one of my shots, and there was a specific reason for it. So we'll cover that later on. But before we get started, how do you get files into this session for us to edit? You upload them there. So that is the web address that you go to. If you go to paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com, that will allow you to upload either your raw file or an EIP. So an EIP is what happens in Capture One when you export your raw file with the adjustments you've made. So if you're struggling with something, send us the EIP and we'll try and get to the bottom of what you're having a problem with. Can't always. I don't think we've ever not, actually. There's a challenge. Try and stump us. That'll work. We'll be back next week for those people that want to stump, but that's how to upload your files. If you don't include your name, we cannot include your image. So please, when you're uploading, include your name, include what the issue is, or whether it's just a general, let's have a look at this, and we'll try and cover as much as we can. In the meantime, between now and next week, you've got access to things like that Facebook group. So things like new releases and new lives, actually, are always announced in there first. But for all of you that want to just get on and edit, we'll do that straight away. So the version that we're using in Capture One today, or the version of Capture One that we're using today, is 16.4.4. Now, most people now are on a new-ish version, so it's just commonly referred to as Capture One. If you're subscribing, the version number is going to become less and less important, other than you'd ideally want to be on the latest one. That is the latest one, that one there. It was released, I think, about 11, 12 days ago, something like that, and it had some bug fixes in. So if you are on a subscription or you've purchased version 16.4 as a perpetual license, then please go into your account, download the latest version, because this version has some fixes for some stuff in it. It is not unusual. Well, anyone know the word CrowdStrike? I think it is. No one knew that name before a couple of weeks ago. Fun. But it is not unusual for bugs to exist in software. It is not possible for software to be completely bug-free all of the time if they're constantly developing it, because you change one thing, it can affect another. That's basically where most bugs come from. The problem is that until they know that a bug exists, it's very difficult for them to fix it. When they do know, hopefully, and actually in the past, they've been pretty quick to arrest any issues like that. But when you find a bug, whether it's in Capture One or your operating system or your security system or whatever, let the people that make the software know. And number two, when you see a new version of that software, check the release notes. Please check the release notes. And then hopefully that will detail the fact that your bug has been fixed. If not, there are trackers on Capture One support site for what's in each version and so on. There is a key thing with the release notes. I swear that Capture One sometimes could write in the release notes that you have to now give up your firstborn child to Denmark. And everyone goes, okay, and installs. Please read them, because those release notes not only cover what cameras are supported, but what functions you should be looking for. Quite often there are brand new functions that people don't even know exist, and they were introduced 4 or 5 versions ago. The release notes are your key to finding out what's in that package, and it will also tell you if any bugs were fixed in the process. So let's get on. First off, I have a request for anyone online right now. Here you go. This is the first bit of interactivity. We're going to come back to this shot from David, but this shot from Lotfi, I think we have not edited. Did that a double negative. I don't think we've edited this shot. I've gone through the last few YouTubes and just checked, and I can't see this picture anywhere. So if we have not, we're going to edit it today. If we have, and my mind is playing tricks, then let me know, and I won't bother boring you again with the exact same edit that we would have done originally. But I can't find it and I can't remember it. So useful. If anyone online remembers this shot and us editing it, then we'll play. If not, then off we go. So David's shot, macro shot. This is a tough one, because some of what we're going to talk about is the ethics of accurate photography versus creative photography. Let's call it that. So what David's got in here is a very minor edit on this. It's actually, out of the camera, it's done pretty good. There is a mask on the fly, which has actually pulled up some exposure and up a bit of brightness and boosted its saturation. So we can see that there. And there's a global mask, which literally just pulls that histogram out. So we're stretching the data from where it was shot here to be our output histogram here. So this here is our input effectively. So I'm matching where these lines are. So I'm pulling anything that was, so remember in photographic terms, or in digital photographic terms, everything is from 0 up to 255. That's typically how we work in levels. And if you look at the top of the screen at any one point in time in Capture One, you will see the red value, the green value, the blue value, unless you've changed to a CMYK profile. But out of the box, you'll see the red, green, and blue values and the overall luminosity. And that's a scale from 0, or as close to 0 as I can find in here, but the darkest bit here, sort of 14, 15, through to the brightest bit, which is possibly over here somewhere. Any advance? Oh, there we are, 224. Okay. So we have data that's visible in our photograph and printable, which is the most important part, from 0, which is basically black, through to 255, which is basically white. Not quite black and white. 0 on the red channel means there is no red in it, and 255 means the red is maxed out. And if you max out red, green, and blue in additive terms on a monitor or on a sensor, you get white. And that's why we refer to it as black to white, but actually it's not necessarily in a color image. It's no red through to maximum red, and then no green through to maximum green, and then no blue through to maximum blue. So for example, if I have 255 red and 255 green and no blue, I don't get white, I get yellow, bright yellow, if that. So what we're looking at here is, if I were to print this image, I want to make sure that I'm getting the most out of that scale. And certain very famous photographers used to have a scale that you'd use from the darkest darks to the lightest lights. And the idea is that any print would have everything in that range. So it would start from the very darkest and it would end at the very brightest. You'd never have that data off to one side or compressed. It would always be stretched. And that's what the levels is allowing us to do. So overall on this picture, what David's done is stretch, basically pull this part, which was originally the brightest part of the image. And by stretching this level slider here, we're translating it, or we're mapping it and saying now, anything that was 217, so a little bit darker than white, or maximum, make that 255. So pull it up, brighten it. And this middle slider here is almost like a mixing machine, which says, well, which side? So if I split the histogram in the middle, do you want to make more brights or more darks? So if I were to move this, we can stretch and say, well, I'm going to push, even though it's still pulling the brightest parts to be brighter, I'm going to push most of the data now darker, or I'm going to pull most of the data to be lighter. And you've got a choice. You don't the linear or proportionate part in that midpoint. But the question is, how do we know if we've squeezed it too much? Because the risk is, with using levels, every now and then, and this one doesn't have any, luckily, but there are some that we'll cover in a second. Every now and then you'll see either a specular highlight or something that's just popping up beyond the bulk of that data. That we don't notice until it's too late. So I'm going to use this one as an example, but ideally we wouldn't ever normally pull the data beyond here. You'll see a spike up here. But more importantly, if you turn your exposure warning on, you'll get a warning when or if it's too late. So I actually know we didn't need to stop at 217 here. That's the fun bit, and that's why I'm talking about this. We've actually got room to pull it down to where? 207 maybe, there's a tiny bit up there, not fussed about that. 208. So we've got another 10 on the scale, but that's actually about 5% more brightness left in this image before anything blows out. One tip that we always used to tell people, and not many people do this, I don't know why, well, maybe I do, it's because the defaults are different. So the defaults in Capture One are a lot more conservative. They can be down, I think, at 250, and the shadows may be something like 5. Well, this is telling me, and it's helpful, don't get me wrong, this is telling me that it's maybe going to clip. So it's on the verge of clipping. It's within the margin of that 255. So, and if you think about it, it's a warning. It's not an absolute. It's not a fine or a penalty. It's a warning. So having these down here at the defaults, okay, no problem. But I'd rather get absolutes. I'd rather be told when it has clipped, both brightness and darkness. So I want a shadow warning that is 0. And I want an exposure warning that's 255. If that makes you nervous, go 254 and 1. But I don't see, personally, the point in having a threshold that is not absolute, a threshold that's interpretive. So it's, you know, you may be getting slightly overexposed, you may be getting slightly underexposed. I want to know when it is, because that means that I can get the maximum out of the data that the camera stored. And that's what levels allows us to do. It allows us to stretch what was originally a, let's just go into create a new variant so you can see. Oh, flipped it as well. So this had a compressed range, a lot of shadow. And if I were to pull this up with just exposure, what happens is, yes, I get my brights to be nice and bright. You can see up here, the histogram's nice and stretched up here. But in the process of that, by pulling up the exposure by 1, because it didn't have a huge dynamic range in the original shot, what it's done is it's pulled everything up and it hasn't left those darkest parts really, really dark. So I'm losing contrast, and that's the risk of doing it this way, because this is a low contrast histogram. If I do it with levels or curves, but levels is probably the easier one in this case, I can stretch it and I can make the brighter parts brighter without pulling up the darkest parts. Now what I can also then do using this middle slider is adjust where that midpoint is. So I might want, you know, the middle point to lift up a little bit, but that's going to be very different. Just close, let's do a new variant of that. It's going to be very different to just using the histogram to get us to that same bright point. Look at these two side by side. Levels on the left, exposure on the right. Both of them have their top exposure at the same point. In fact, the one at the left actually has it slightly higher. We've hit the exposure warning on the left. So let's just fix that. Let's just come back to there. So both of these images, the left and the right, are exposing to the same maximum level if you were to print it. But the one on the left has got a lot more contrast in it. The one on the right is overall more bright. And it's because of the one on the right we've used exposure. The one on the left we've used levels to stretch rather than shift that histogram. So we're going to come back to that in this session because there's a couple of other examples of that. But back to the ethic-y bit. So number one, can we stretch this histogram a bit more? Yes, we can. And use your exposure warning. If ever you're playing with levels or curves, please turn that exposure warning on and adjust your preferences to match what you want to see on the screen. Then we come to nature. So for example, I would want to clean that up. I don't know if that's a spot on his eye or if it's a bit of pollen or whatever else. I would clean it up. But a naturist, not a naturalist, oh, which way round is it? One of them's nude and one of them's into bugs. Either way, whichever the one that's into bugs is, would often say you need to leave it. It's a natural part of that fly in that condition. Or that, what is it actually? It's a good question. But this is down to you. It's down to your choices that you make on it. What I would say, David, is although it's on a macro lens, and I know it's sometimes difficult with this in terms of apertures, to me, this fall off is really, really harsh, and I can't change that in Capture One. So with Capture One, we can add a bit of structure in here. So if I were to add a little bit of a new layer, so let me just put a new layer structure. We're always naming our layers now, aren't we? Full opacity, a low flow, because I'm going to paint it in. And I'm going to add in onto this layer quite a bit of structure and also quite a bit of sharpening. A low radius and a low threshold, so it's quite subtle. But I can now paint in here a bit more detail. And this is going to be so subtle because it's so out of focus. I'm just going to turn my exposure warning off. To get a little bit more texture in this back part of the fly. So if I turn it off there and on there, you should be able to see it. Let's go to 200% so you can see it a bit better. So if I look at this bit, which is nice and sharp, this bit isn't. So let's paint in a little bit in here. And this is just the fall off from the lens. So because it was shot at f9, which sounds like a deep aperture, but on a macro lens, you're so close that f9 has an eyelash's worth of depth of field. The problem is that fall off is so harsh on any object which is round or domed, and of course this thing is. So to me, this is wonderful at the front, but then immediately this is out, and these are slightly out, and it falls off here and it falls off here, and it doesn't just fall off a little bit; it falls off rapidly. So to me, I'd be in a place of maybe shifting that aperture if you can to a bit deeper. That will affect your ISO potentially. It would affect your shutter time, but that would give you a bit more clarity on the insect itself rather than having to rely on just focusing on the eyes, unless that was the intention. If it was the intention, great. But to me, even if the eyes were the intention, this bit is a little distracting because he's slightly off the focal plane. So two questions in there. Number one, how true to life do you want it to be? Number two, how much sharper can we get it by using a different aperture? Overall, I would maximize your histogram. Use the levels tool to get as much out of it, especially in an image which is relatively abstract like this. I personally, I personally would heal this. So that's my healing brush up here, the little band-aid sticker. There's another copy of it here which you can use, or you can press the Q key on your keyboard. Now the healing is probably going to get it wrong on this because it's not going to know where to pick it from. But let's just draw always bigger than the area you want to heal. It picked it wrong. Now this is going to be difficult because the pattern isn't quite right. Because the pattern is different as it moves around the angle of the eye, but that's not bad. There, let's just go one more to there. And you know what? I was about to say we need to go into a pixel editor, but actually at 100%, that's pretty much spot on. Ethics, your shout. Whether or not you'd want to leave that bit in there or not, entirely up to you. Nature people would probably say leave it on. Overall on this shot, I would be tempted just from a focal point of view, because it's specifically this part that's sharp and the rest of it does fall pretty quickly. I would actually put in a tiny bit of a vignette around it. That's one stop of vignette. It's not a huge amount, but, and again, because our brightest parts, our highlights, were out of the edge, that gives us a bit more room even on the image to pull, where are we there, a bit more brightness overall there and get a bit more contrast out of it still, because we're now not clipping the stuff around the outside because that's got a vignette. Remember, with vignette, just like the black and white tool, it's one of the rare tools in Capture One where it does not matter what layer I'm on, because it's a global adjustment. So vignette happens globally no matter where I am. You'll notice the tool doesn't change between different layers. Same with the black and white tool. Everything else, pretty much, if you make a change, it's going to happen onto the layer that you're on. Apart from, I think, single pixel. Single pixel doesn't do that either. So that would be it for me. Small change. The edit is good because it's starting from a great place, David. It's a nice shot. But I would play with a slightly smaller aperture, maybe. So apparently, from two good sources, one is Hello Egon, who says he's watched every single live session basically and hasn't edited the shot. The second is Lotfi himself, who said, no, we haven't edited it. So let's get on to this one. And because I've left the exposure warning on rather handily, look at that. It's telling us that some stuff's overexposed. There's 3 versions that were sent here. And I'm not sure which one is sort of the final one, but let's assume it's this one because it looks the most vibrant. The challenge that was sent in was basically, you know, it is golden hour. It feels like golden hour. There was a glow, but the original raw picture does not represent it. My challenge is I don't think that does either. And actually what we've got is now a mix of, it's not, so the one on the right is not real, the one on the left isn't representative. This is a real sticky one to try and work through. Lotfi's used golden hour, which is one of the elevation styles. So we could load that in under landscapes. So it's the shadow lifting version. There's a highlights reducing version and a default version. The problem with using these styles, and I think we talked about this quite a while ago, but I sort of want to reiterate it. The style is almost the icing on the cake. So the style allows us to stylize a picture that's already set in a good place. The problem with loading those 2 style layers on top of here, so we've got a tower mask to lift that up, but this isn't starting yet at this point from a great base. It's for sure, it's different to the original, but let me just give you an example. If I were to clone this variant and reset, actually, this variant, so I should have done a new variant, there we go. And from here, load on golden hour, you're going to get a very, very different result from here with golden hour. The same filter, same style loaded on. So there to there. And it's because all the style is doing is it's taking colors in the sky and the ground and it's enhancing them. And golden hour is a very specific style, which it's looking for warm tones and it's enhancing how warm they are. So there's an amalgamation within the color editor that takes everything that was sort of slightly yellowy greeny and it pushes it to be more orange, takes the things that were red and it gives them a bit more richness. So it's looking for, ironically, stuff that's at golden hour, and it's designed to enhance that. If you start from something that doesn't have a golden hour feel to it, so look at where it has done the work. It's taken where there were golden elements, so these yellows, really, really subtle yellows up here, really, really subtle oranges in here, and it's enhanced them. But the problem is, because the image is starting off so blue, it can't really work much more than that. So I'd be in a place where, personally, let's just reset everything on that one, get rid of all my layers. And it's interesting, there was a tower mask on this one to lift it up. The reason it needed lifting up was because in the original image, where were we? In curves, the shadow had been brought down. So all of this lot here sits in the shadow. So if we darken that even more, we're going to lose the detail. Then you've got to add a mask back on the tower to lift it up. So you're seesawing each time. So where I would be, personally, first off, with a white balance that's really tricky, and the camera's got it as 5500, which is probably the camera's daylight setting, which is possibly where this started going wrong. Try Capture One's Auto. So Capture One's Auto is looking for things that it should be white, and it's going to try and tweak the overall tone of the image. Now, in this case, it's got colder. Why is that? Because there's everything in this image, even if I look out here to this concrete, looks like it should be cool. So what happens if I choose this concrete and say, there we go, that should be white. That's what I basically told it with the dropper. And I can pick anywhere in the dropper. If I pick somewhere in the sea, it's going to go a bit cooler. Pick something that should be a white wall, and I get a warmer, not necessarily warm, but a warmer shot. I've got a big issue up here with some overexposed sky. Now I could try and pull that back with a highlight recovery, but then I'm starting to flatten the image. Now look at our histogram here. If our histogram was nice and spiky, we'd have a huge contrast image to play with. But because it's all clumped in the middle, as I start reducing highlights and lifting shadows, let's do it. So highlights recovered, shadows recovered. I lose all the contrast in this image. So everything that we just talked through in levels just now you're going to be in a place where you're losing all of the what we'd want, which is to stretch it ready for print to get the highest level of brights and the lowest level of darks. So we don't want that. This isn't great to start with. What I'd be tempted to do, and if you go back to the previous session, we talked about linear response as a tool, as a base characteristic, as it's called, for the curve. So the curve, the default curve for most cameras in Capture One is one called film standard. That's what, for most people, when you click on auto, it's giving you. You can switch that to be high contrast. In this case, that's risky because of that bright sky. We can switch it to be extra shadow, or we can switch it to be linear response. Linear response flattens the curve, so it takes away the default slight S curve, which darkens and lightens. So it darkens shadows and lightens the highlights. If you're in your image and you're putting in an S curve in the curves tool, and you're on auto or film standard, you're doubling down on that S curve because Capture One has already put one in as part of the curve in the base characteristics. Sorry, mind blank. So I'm going to use linear response because I don't want it to push this sky too much, and I don't want it to darken down these buildings. So normally we'd recommend linear response where there's huge differences in contrast. In this case, the default would be, well, it's all a bit of a bell curve, so we don't need linear response. I disagree, because although we've got most of the data in the middle, we've got a huge clump of it down here in the shadows and a huge spike of it here in the highlights. So that's our base curve done. Now what happens if I pull down my highlights? I can recover just that bit up there. In fact, I could just use the white slider to recover that up there. Let's turn on our exposure warning. It's still going to say it's over. Why? Because one or more of the channels is clipped. In this case, the red channel. Look at those numbers at the top. So it's not the red channel because I was on the red warning. It doesn't work like that. But out of all of the red, green, and blue, it's the red that's clipped. It's at 255. There's not much we can do about that. If I were to pull down the exposure, it is going to come down, but there's no more data in there. So I've got a decision to make. And personally, I'd be in a place of, given that it is just this upper layer, maybe we create, using this tool, the gradient tool, a sky gradient up here. Let's turn on my mask. So use the M key on your mask to do that. And I'm just going to use the Option key, so the Alt key, or Option on a Mac, to move this side to be smaller than this side. And the reason is because I want this to start at the 100 here, right on the edge of this bright stuff. I want it to slowly taper off to 50% here. And then I want it to really, really slowly, so more slowly, taper off to 0. And the reason that is, or the reason for that is that the human eye doesn't quite work it out. Doesn't notice there's a filter there as such. With that filter, I can pull down highlights, I can pull down whites, and I can also pull down a touch of exposure to get this back without affecting any of this stuff down here. So I haven't affected the highlights down here at all. If I turn on a grayscale mask, so Option and M, or Alt and M, we can see the mask effects where it is effective is white, where it's not effective is black. So the mask affects the top part most, then it fades off into nothing down here. So that's our sort of, let's call it neutralizing. We've got now the tones all within our histogram. We've now got to tweak it. So now I can go back to my image layer, or I could create a new filled layer, which applies to everything. I'm going to call this one global adjustments. This one we're going to call sky. So on my global adjustments layer, I'm going to go into the curve, and we've got two choices of curve. We cover this quite often, but if I create a luma curve, it's only changing the brightness. If I create an RGB curve, it is also changing the saturation of certain colors. And the reason it's doing that is, as you can see, these colors don't perfectly align. On a luma curve, it's just looking at the grayscale values. On the top of your screen, this right-hand one, that one that says 152 right now. On the RGB curve, if you imagine, as I'm changing, because remember this curve is a translation, so it's a map effectively, kind of like levels. So this point here is saying, if you look at the numbers at the bottom, whatever was a 172 in input now needs to be a 191. And it will slowly taper that off. So 155 becomes 169 until it gets to here, the midpoint, where 129 is basically the same. And then once it goes south of that midpoint, it goes to its maximum difference here, which is 89 becomes 80, so darken. And it then slowly curves or ramps that up. But you notice we've increased the curve. So we've increased contrast, but we haven't got any clipping. There's still no exposure warning in my image. Okay. If I wanted to pull up these very, very darkest parts, I could either use the black slider or the shadow slider, or I could lift up my curve slightly at the end. Rick, question. So if the red channel is clipped, why not just adjust the red channel and back it off? Because if I do that, let's do it. Let me just create a clone of this variant. I'm going to use the sky layer that we already have. If I just take the red channel and back it off, so let's do it in levels to make the point. So we're going to change its brightest part. Let me just where are we? Let's reset all that was done there. So we're now going to do it with the red channel. I'm going to move my brightest part of the red channel. So I'm using the top now. So we're translating the other way. We're saying what was 255, I actually need you now to be, where are we? In fact, there's other colors that are clipped up there, but let's imagine. Yeah, the green is also clipped up there. Let me pull back a little bit of exposure to help the green. Right. So I've now pulled this down so there is no red clipped. But what's also happened? So the question that Rick had is, if the red channel's clipped, why not just adjust the red curve and back it off? The problem with just adjusting the red, whether I do that in the curve or whether so I can go into the red curve here, I can do it in the levels tool, it's going to do the same thing. The problem is, if I'm just adjusting one curve, I'm adjusting the tone of that area. So in this area, we've got a mask up here. By reducing the red, what gets left is the green and the blue. So I've now got a greeny blue sky. Whereas by doing it naturally, by bringing them all down at the same amount, at the same level, we keep most of the toning up there. Still not perfect, but that's we haven't actually altered any individual color. But what it is doing is at least keeping it relatively stable. Whereas here, we're definitely shifting colors, and it's why those color channels are really powerful, but they're really dangerous at the same time. Use them for color grading. If you want to split tone and you want to enhance a certain colorway within an image, by all means, use individual levels. And it's also one of the other reasons that people will set their levels to be red, green, and blue channels independently. The risk with that is when you do that, if the red, green, and blue tones are out of sync, you're changing, when you do the auto levels tool, you're changing which ones stretch more or less, and that can shift the color more or less. So yes, in theory, you could do it that way. In practice, you've got to be very careful if you are. So I've got our protected sky. If anything, actually, on here, we probably want to make it a little more red, but we wouldn't do it in there. What we do is possibly either do it with a bit of a white balance shift and a tint. Yeah, maybe there. Or we do it in the color editor. So we've lifted the shadows in that global adjustments thing. The very, very bottom shadows that were 0 are now 5. So in other words, there's nothing that's pitch dark in here. We've boosted the upper midtones and we've darkened the lower midtones. Now I've got an ability with my exposure warning on to pull some contrast. And contrast isn't quite as simple as just splitting smack down the middle. It's doing some clever stuff behind the scenes, but essentially it is taking that midpoint and it's boosting and reducing either side of 128. I can realistically shift our levels a little bit just to lighten up those midtones. So this is kind of like putting a bump in the middle in your curve, same thing. But most importantly, what I can now do is lift brightness a little bit. And you notice brightness isn't the same as exposure. Saturation a little bit. I'm just really careful of up there. So with my sky, I'm going to pull down our brightness a little bit, protect those highlights a bit more, just so that we don't clip them. And now if I start playing with all of my different styles, I get a very different effect. And I would be on a page of probably something a little less golden hour, because there's not much golden hour to play with here. I'd be in a place of maybe morning coffee out of those styles. There are loads of other styles you can choose from. But if I were to pull this down to maybe there, that gets us there. It's softer, yes. We've got a little bit of an issue there, and that's because this style has actually brought up some of the... not actually sure what that's brought up. It's probably one of the color editor things. We can pull the style effect down and it's going to have less of an effect. But overall, this is a flat image. If we go back to that original histogram out on here, even though you've got massive brights, they're overexposed. And the problem with that is, in order to get those brights back under control, we're flattening the data, and you can see it in this histogram here. So the only way then of really shifting that data is to build in more and more and more S-curve. And as we do that, we can start to improve the image, but we can also start to hurt it. We do want to fix and, I guess, hold and protect those upper highlights. We don't want this red exposure warning to grow. But what we can do is play with this bit of data here in the middle, because we know that most of our data sits here. Most of this grey stuff is in here, and this is the town. I know that because as I move my mouse around, this orange bar is telling me where it is. So all of this stuff is sat in that little lump there. All of the sky is sat in this great big lump here, and this bright stuff is up here. So we want to protect the bright stuff. Don't touch that. This is a no-go zone, basically. I do want to lift up the rest of the sky, and I do want to maybe protect those shadows. So if I now, knowing that, start playing like this, you notice where we get to? So we haven't done that huge, harsh, crispy contrast. It's a lot more subtle. We can go for a similar crop. I think it was a 2x1. I may be wrong, Lotfi, but hopefully I'm not. No, maybe it was a 3x2. Maybe it was a 16:9. 3x2 would be the full thing. Maybe it's a 16:9. Let's have a look. So does that match roughly where you were at? If I pull this up to there, yeah, that looks like it. So it was a 16:9 crop. But I've got a lot more latitude in here without any of that crispiness and without any of the crushed edges. So I don't have shadows that are in warning. I don't have highlights that are all overdone. With this, because I've now effectively separated out those two parts with a curve, so I've darkened the darkest parts, or protected them more importantly, and I've lifted the lighter parts. Don't want to lift it too much because otherwise you lose all the contrast in it. And we want texture in the sky. But because I've done that and not lost any of the highlights in the process, we're then in a place where I can start using other tools. They come to life. So clarity, I can start using. Again, keep an eye on this stuff, and you notice we haven't had to pull up the tower. I can use structure. I can use a bit of dehaze. Again, not too much. And you see it's getting darker here. It's because it's picked on the wrong shadow tone. If I choose a cloud shadow tone, where are we? There. I'm going to back that away a little bit. It's a bit too much. But I'm not losing any detail, and I haven't had to lift up that tower. The tower never went dark because I protected it in the curves, and we also protected it in levels. So with the rest of it, it's then a case of playing maybe with color editor. You know, we could, in the global adjustments for our color balance, we could say we want our highlights to be warmer. We want our shadows to maybe be a bit cooler. Midtones maybe a bit more blue, but that's going to affect the clouds a little bit. But maybe we go to there. You can play with this. Just be careful with that little dot up there. So with our sky, is it sky or is it morning coffee that's doing that? It's sky is going to help that. So with my sky, remember it only affects the top part as a gradient. So I can maybe pull down a little bit of contrast. Sorry, a little bit of exposure, and maybe a little more highlight and white because it's not going to affect anywhere else on the picture. I'm happy with a little bit of overexposure there. But this just gives me a lot more room, a lot more latitude to play with the other tools because I'm not hitting the edges. In here, we're flat out. Look at this histogram. Right up the top here, we've got a spike. I can't go any further. Right at the bottom here, we've got a spike. I can't go any further. So I'm jammed now. I can't play with anything else. I can't edit anymore. Here, we've got some room. We've got some room for the highlights to grow into. We've got some room for the shadows to still move into. So even though it's still the same challenging shot, I mean, it's a challenging light condition. And I'm not entirely sure where you actually go with it, to be honest, because even if I were to pull our white balance even warmer, you know, maybe that gets you your golden hour sort of feel that you were after. I don't know. I wasn't there, so I don't know, but it's certainly very different to what the camera saw. That's your call, but this is about getting the data right. So get that histogram under control, get it stretched out so you've got the most out of the dynamic range, and then play with your toys. These things here, clarity, dehaze, structure, and whatever, they're all toys. They're all good fun, but they're not if you're already maxing out at the edge of the histogram because you've got nowhere for them to go. And everything then becomes crunchy and it becomes harsh. It's black, white. That's it. Where are we at? Georg. Good example here. So, question on histogram. It's like a lesson. Ooh. What's wrong with this picture? So here's the original. Let's just do the without edit. So let me just create a new variant so we can actually compare. So Georg was worried that the sky was very flat. There wasn't enough detail in the sky. So what Georg's done is effectively added a vignette and not mills. Reduce the brightness of everything that's not a windmill, and everything that is a windmill, increase the brightness a little bit. I'm not sure how much of an effect that's having. The top grad, decrease the brightness again, so try and match this up here to this down here, and then a healing brush. But I'm in a place where I don't think it needed any of that, if I'm honest. One, in this case here, I'd be back to my image layer. Look at all this room up here. And here's the other thing. If you want to check print, turn on your proof margin. Right click, change this to white. If you want to worry about how dark an image is, isn't it odd? Here's our standard in Capture One. Doesn't look so bad, right? Here's our black. Oh, it's quite nice. Colorful, lifted. Here's how it will print against white paper. Dark as anything. So if I'm using this as a way of gauging it, look at all this room we've got to spread. Look at our histogram up here. So I'm going to go to the overall image layer. I could create a filled layer, same thing. and lift that up. And on white, this now looks better. But more importantly, even on a dark frame, it looks so much better again. So that's how it was. That's now. So I haven't adjusted anything else that Georg's done. That I've left everything as it was. We're not even at the top of the histogram. If I turn the exposure warning on, you don't hit that for until there. I mean, we're actually beyond halfway on that histogram. So we're so underexposed. We'd actually shift the histogram to be the white, or the bright point is now at less than 255 or 128, which is crazy, really. If anything, what it does tell us is you had a bit more room, in fact, probably a couple stops more room up here to expose brighter when you were there. Now, it may be you couldn't, it may be that the shutter speed was important, it may be that, I don't know, the light was changing, there's lots of different reasons, but in this edit here, there's nothing really wrong with the edit. Lifting up, pulling down, brightness changes, it's all good stuff. But if I were to print your original one, you're going to need a flashlight to see it. So you started out brighter, but by trying to get all of that color back, and I get why, you've lost all of the tone, you've lost all that dynamic range, and you've got so much range in this shot. That's so much better, and it just needs you to stretch the data to be up to the brighter areas. Again, you've got some areas here that are clipping with an exposure warning. Why are they? Well, probably because the red channel here, yeah, somewhere along there is a very, very specific. There we are, 255 is there. Overall, there's a wider issue here with the shot, which is it's slightly off in terms of focus. So we can fix it to a certain extent. You're going to have some fall off because they go out into the distance. That's okay. But this one, if this is our subject, it really needs to be a bit sharper. So I'd be tempted, new layer, AI mask. Let's try, could try and get it to do a subject, but let's just do it with clicking the paddles and so on. So I'm clicking all the bits that I want in my AI mask. I'll let it spread out to there. Don't forget reflections. It's very odd if you're only adjusting the original, not the reflection. The reflection will be blurrier, obviously. It's a reflection, but we'll get there close. So that's my mask out of AI. It's not very neat. So I'm going to go to refine mask. That's better. Now, it doesn't have to be up at 300 all the time, but we want the mask to spill a little bit. So in other words, it slowly fades out, a bit like focus fall off, and slowly gets you to no mask at all. And it also means if I go to my eraser and we set this to a low opacity, I can manually also now have that fall off. Great. Now with this, I sort of alluded to it on the previous a couple of images ago. We can do this with sharpening, but I'd be tempted to do a mix. Again, you'll see me do this quite a lot. A little bit of sharpening with a low radius and a low threshold. So don't spread too far from the edge, maybe 0.6, but don't need too much before you start sharpening. So we go to there. And I'm going to use the structure tool, which is under clarity. And the structure tool just crisps things up a little bit. It can introduce noise if you do too much. If you want a quick guide on that, where's the little thing? I can press a button. Under there, on our YouTube channel, you'll find a section called Pro Tips. And in there is one about clarity, structure, and sharpening, which will go through exactly what each of those do. But while this isn't perfectly crisp, if I take that layer off, you can see it's a lot more blurry. I'll zoom in at 200% so you can see. So that's on, that's off, on, off. It's not the perfect fix, but it does at least kind of rescue where we're at. Overall, though, absolutely, don't leave your images at this level of brightness. If you're in a dark room and you don't want to hurt anyone's retinas, maybe. But if you're trying to display and show off your images, You need, I mean, it doesn't have to be always at the very right-hand wall. It doesn't need that. And especially if you're doing pastel-y sort of images and calm images, they're quite often clumped in the middle. They're low contrast, but they're not all in the shadows. So use your levels tool or your curve, both, to pull it up. Path, I think you were asking about the previous one. So let's just go back to Lotfi's shot. Question was, would a luma range on the sky also help, or is it overkill? It could do. So there's a very specific reason for using a luma range. We'll just cover it very quickly. So I'm going to create a new layer, luma sky. And let's do this really lazy. Let's just do a quick gradient on that luma sky layer up there. So let's imagine I only want to affect the brightest parts of the sky. So I've now got a mask that's pretty much over the sky, stops by here. Great. But I only want the brightest parts. So I can go to a luma range and I can say, imagine this represents your histogram. I want everything up bright, but out of what is in the gradient mask, do not try and grab anything that is less than 212. And in fact, actually, no, we'll go less than that, so 200. But once you do start backing away, be really, really subtle about it. You see like that? We can put a radius on the edge, so it softens it, and hit apply. What that allows me to do with a luma range is I can now change exposure, but just on those parts of the sky. The problem that you're seeing, and it becomes very evident, if your luma range is only on certain brightnesses, it's very tricky, because if I pull this exposure on the mask, and let me just remind you what that mask looks like. It looks like this. So if I pull this bit of sky to be darker than something that's next to it, it looks odd, looks weird, looks horrible. So be really, really careful with that. Yes, you can on very specific areas use a luma range just to target the highlight. But if you're going to pull it down more than the surrounding area, you get this weird matted sort of matte paint flat effect. And you would have been better off effectively just doing the overall sky, because then at least it brings down everything around it to a similar amount. So yes, but be careful. It can go very wrong. Because we're on this subject, next week, and we are about next week, we're going to cover this one, Dave's panorama, where we want to introduce some layers of mist. We're also going to get Dave a level head when he's shooting panoramics, but we'll see what we can do with that, because there are other tools that can help with it. But on pretty much today's subject around, maximizing, I guess, contrast. Here's a shot that I took in Death Valley. And so someone asked, how do we get images to pop effectively? And specifically, how do I treat my shots that I shoot? So this is Death Valley. It's very unusual to get fog in Death Valley, but we did. And it's lovely and crisp. And we've got all this detail out in the back rocks, the back hills. We've got all this nice soft fog out here in the foreground. All of this texture in here through the canyon, with all of these little sort of layers and misty parts, but we've got all this crunchy stuff up here too, and we want to get all of that into one image while keeping it harmonious. So if you want to look at the raw, so without any changes, it looks like that. So first question that someone was asking is, how much do we change images? Not a lot. A bit for sure. So you can see the difference there. If I do it before and after, you will be able to see the difference. But we're not doing massive changes. What we're doing is accentuating parts that we want to be more prominent. And we do that by either reducing the prominence of some parts, or by picking them individually and pulling them up. And pulling them up doesn't necessarily mean brightening them, it just means giving them more presence. So this is a really, really, really easy, simple edit. And we can just deconstruct it. So there's a heel there, obviously. There's a couple of dust spots and stuff like that. Fine. Let's ignore that one for now. There is an adjustment layer that only affects this top bit here. Now, from memory, and this is going back a little while, from memory, this wasn't done with an AI mask. This was actually done originally with a Luma range. Funnily enough, what we just talked about there. Because this dark area here in the foreground gave me a really clean line to be able to build a mask around it. So it was originally, and you can see it falling off a little bit, it was originally a gradient. Then we Luma ranged it to remove anything that was dark, and then I refined it. So this refined mask, you see it starts to, you can tell a mask has been refined because you start seeing detail in it that it wouldn't be possible really to draw. So it's a gradient, then a Luma range to exclude the bit we didn't want. Then you rasterize it. So how do you rasterize it? Well, we go onto a mask and we go to rasterize mask, or into here, go to rasterize mask. Or if you go and change a gradient by trying to erase it or paint it, it will first say, I need to rasterize. But we effectively isolate everything in this top part of the image with a mask. It's that simple. That mask darkens, so a bit of exposure, 0.2 of a stop. There is a difference, slight difference, but there is a difference in the white balance. The overall image, 6271, 4.6. That layer, 6789, so a bit warmer, and 8.5, a bit pinker. And you can see that, so you can see the difference, especially in the sky and the clouds, but also up here. Now, the problem with making that change to be more pink is that those mountains had a bit of a sort of magenta haze to them. So we pulled down the highlights. That gets us our detail in the clouds back. But we've used a little bit of dehaze on top of that, which gets rid of the sort of bluey pink up there. A lot of clarity. 30 on clarity is quite a lot. Be careful with that. But these hills and these mountains can take it. And you can see how much detail you're able to drag out. If I look into here, I love this mountain range. Look at that. Oops, this is going to go a bit too big. Let's go to 50%. Let's go to 100%. So look at the detail that most of this is clarity and dehaze that's done that. So look at that. That's what you're able to get away with if you don't apply it to the whole image. If we'd applied the same amount of clarity to the whole image, you're going to start slashing people's eyes. Don't do that. It's not nice. So be selective with it. Be selective with the bits that you want to highlight and bring to the foreground. And if it is a crunchy, rocky, textured area, you can get away with more on that slider than you would do normally. There is also on here a tiny little shift on the shadows to make the shadows more green. If I turn this off, I don't know whether you'll be able to see from there. Maybe you will. There is a very subtle, still pink hue. You notice that there? I don't know if you'll see it. So that's with it left originally, and that's with the adjustment. So originally, adjustment. By shifting the shadows to be green, we're not making them green. We're taking away some of the pink that was in the shadows. So effectively, I'm keeping them colored. I'm not desaturating them. I've still got color data in there, but I'm shifting just the bits that were really too pink in the dark areas of this area and just moving them to be a bit green. So away from pink. It's less about making them green. It's more about making them less pink. There is a vivacity layer on there. So that's one of the, funnily enough, cityscape filters or styles. These are split down to cities versus landscapes, but I quite often use the wrong one in the wrong place. Seagrass is kind of cool for things like Iceland and New Zealand and stuff. But use whatever one works to get you what you want. And if I turn this off, you'll see what Vivacity's done is it's overall just boosted everything. It's just given everything a bit of a pop. It's only 27% opacity. It's a very, very small amount of it. But you can see that difference. It's just lifted stuff. So then when I look at the original through to here, or as we normally do before through to after, you see that difference. Each of that you can see now, each of those tiny little changes is a tiny little change. It's not big differences. You don't see 16 layers and crafting different color profiles and different contrast curves and every single layer and whatever. We don't do that. We'll pick on what's the subject. What do I want to blend into not be the first thing the viewer sees? How do I want the toning to feel? And just make small adjustments that compound to make a big change. Each of those adjustments is a tiny one, but the overall effect, pretty big. Roger, if a mask has been over-refined, is it possible to reduce the refinement? Undo not being possible in other edits. So, ish. If I go to this mask here, which has had a... In fact, let's go back to Georg's shot, actually. That's probably a fair one to use. My sharpening mask. In my refine mask, I can go to 0. No, actually, no. I'm telling lies. I'm thinking about the wrong tool. I'm thinking about the dehaze tool. No, you can't go back beyond. What you can do is undo, obviously, but there's no negative on refine. So is it possible to reduce it? No, because, and actually you made the point, your undo is only good in that session, those edits, or you're going to lose the other edits that you did since that undo point. But no, unlike things like clarity and dehaze with the refine tool, no. What you could do, arguably, is maybe paint in the, it's going to sound weird, but paint in the gaps in between those areas. If it was a very simple area, you could fill it, but it's going to do a sledgehammer to crack a nut. So no, be careful with the refine tool. If you're worried about it when you're doing refine, don't have it up here all the time. Start off at 50, 60. You can always refine and refine again. You can refine as many times as you want. I can do this, apply. I can do it again, apply, again, apply, and it will keep on going. But doing that in smaller increments is going to be safer than doing it in larger ones, for obvious reasons. And especially, no, we can't go back. And yeah, so to Brian's point, Feather won't get what we want, because Feather's going to blur it more. It's not going to blur it less. So no, I would say no, I'm afraid. But there we go. So that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back next Tuesday, which is the, where are we? 13th. So hopefully that sort of helped with getting data out, histogram-y stuff, contrasty stuff, and all of that. For some reason, I have lost my mouse, which isn't very helpful, because I think I've got a window up somewhere for that feather tool, and I don't know where it's gone. So sorry about that. I can't go through images, but Adam, if you duplicate the mask, it's going to literally duplicate the mask with the refinement. So if I were to do that, it's not going to quite hit what we want, unfortunately. If I were to copy the mask from another area, yeah, it's not going to quite get it. Let me just see if I can get our thing back. Talk amongst yourselves for a second, or consider what you're going to do to upload files next week. Oh, I can't even quick capture one. I think I have broken my capture one. It does happen. Sorry about that. Good job it happened now, eh? 3 minutes over time. Right. For all of you that want to upload, you've just seen on screen. For those of you that want to have a chat, you're more than welcome there. If you want to look at masterclasses on long exposure, cityscapes, mask stuff for golden hour, planning stuff, whatever, that's what those are. You can go to that in the description. But for now, between now and next Tuesday, send in your stuff. We'll have a look and edit as many as we can. But look after yourselves, and we'll see you then. Bye.